Hello everybody. Today we are looking at how to create a favicon for your website. We're going to be using Photoshop today and then getting into our HTML code so that we can implement the favicon. I'm here in Canvas on our page, which is also titled Creating a Favicon for Your Website. And just as a reminder, though I know we've already discussed it in class, favicons, which are up here in the tabs of the browsers, are a part of the branding strategy for a website or a product or an entity. So noticing up here at the top bar, the favicons that I currently have open, I think many of you can probably recognize some of these favicons very easily because they are websites that you travel frequently. So what we're seeing in here would be the CR College favicon, Amazon, Facebook. Out here we have a site that actually doesn't have a favicon loaded, and so we're seeing a blank space for that. Over here, this is a Google favicon, and this is actually a Google Forms favicon. So some of these might be a little bit more familiar than others. You can also see in here, which this is my bookmarks bar inside of Chrome, that we also have favicons that are showing up there as shortcut icons as a reminder to me about what websites I might want to be able to get to really quickly. So favicons, again, are used as a way to identify bookmarks, as a way to create shortcut icons, possibly from your desktop or from your mobile device. And then they're also here inside of the browser, again, as a reminder of the brand identity. And we want to tie that visual into the other branding and identity design choices that we've already made. So color choice from our websites or our product, typography, if we're working with a graphic motif or certain symbols or style of symbols, then we would also want that to transfer into our favicon. Another thing I just wanted to bring up while we're talking about the design of the favicon is that when we are making decisions about how we are going to design the favicon, we need to look at the amount of detail that will actually show up, be present, and be functional in a favicon. When the favicon is scaled here, it's going to be about 16 pixels by 16 pixels, which is really way too small to be able to apply and utilize any detail work. So if you look at the Amazon favicon, you can see that really all it is a very large lowercase a from the Amazon logo type, and then below it, but very hard to see, is a slight little sort of golden color directional line / smile, which comes from the Amazon branding. Looking to the right over here at Facebook, all we have is a blue square with a white Facebook F on it. It's a little bit off center to the right, matches the branding of Facebook, and it's so simple and very easy to read. Looking at Craigslist in here with the peace sign, also very easy to read. Pinterest, single letter form, inside of a red circle in here. Microsoft with the 4 color boxes in here. Amazon Smile is very similarly related to Amazon, the direct icon, but it is a different color scheme just to help us identify it as being for Amazon Smile. So again, thinking about how you design the favicon is going to be really important before you get started. No detail, large graphics or symbols take up the full design space. So we've just covered a little bit about the design of a favicon and the use of a favicon in a website, but now we need to talk about how do we actually build a favicon. So I'm going to scroll down inside of our posting to the section on creating and implementing a favicon. And just right off the bat, I want you to know that there is a link in here to a favicon test file that you can actually test and play around with before you design your own. If you'd like to work the process first that way, you can link to that. But if you'd like to just get started with your own favicon, then you're going to follow the instructions that are here inside of our Canvas posting. There is another section in here that is devoted to something called the Real Favicon Generator. The Real Favicon Generator is an interesting process because what it will do is take your one graphics file and it will process that and export it out for you as many different graphics files that can be used across different platforms, different devices. It can be used to create icons on an Android device. icons on an iOS device so that you can have shortcuts, somewhat like an app icon on your phone for your website. So it comes with a lot of bells and whistles. I'm not actually going to demonstrate that process today, so if you are interested in implementing that yourself, you're going to have to go through that process on your own, though I do give you fairly well-defined instructions here in case you'd like to try that. I'm only going to be working with the very simple favicon that will be useful just for the browser. So that's what I'm going to go ahead and get started with inside of Photoshop. Okay, so we're back and I am currently loaded up into Photoshop where I'm going to create a new document for the favicon graphic, and then I'm going to design the graphic, export the graphic, and then load it into my website using a little bit of HTML. So you can do this process in Photoshop, or you could do this inside of Illustrator if you prefer that. The key here is that I'm going to be starting off with a document that is 260 pixels by 260 pixels square, and then I am going to process that through the Save for Web dialog box. You can do the same thing inside of Illustrator. You just need to be careful that you're working with a square format and that you also take it through the Save for Web dialog box. So I'm going to come over to the left-hand side of Photoshop's welcome screen to create a new document. And the document that I'm going to be creating is going to be a custom document. Over here on the right-hand side, I'm going to name it Favicon. And down below, I'm going to set its dimensions. So it's going to be 260 pixels. And if this wasn't set at pixels when you first opened up into this dialog box, you would actually want to set this to pixels before you put the width or the height in. And the reason for that is because if this was set at inches and you change it to 260, you're going to get a really weird value in here. So I'm going to set mine both width and height to be 260 pixels. The resolution is ultimately going to be scaled down to 72 pixels per inch, but as a way to help me have a higher fidelity and higher resolution when I'm crafting this icon, I'm actually going to start it at 300 pixels per inch. So the file is going to start off a little bit heavier, a little bit larger, but by the time we go through the Save for Web dialog box, it's going to be optimized down for web ready file anyway. But during the development process, I'd rather see it at 300 pixels per inch and get a better preview while I'm working on it. So since it's not going to matter in the end, once we take it through Save for Web, it's going to be scaled down in terms of resolution. Everything else about how I have my document set up right now is going to be just fine. So I'm going to keep it as a white background. We can also change that once we get into Photoshop, so we could actually remove the white background if we wanted this to be a transparent graphic. I'm going to go ahead and say Create. And here is my graphic file. Starts off with a white background here inside of Photoshop. Again, if I wanted this to be transparent, and I'm going to go ahead and switch over into Chrome, the browser, so I can show you what I mean by a transparent background versus a background or a favicon with a solid color background. Let me flip over here into into Chrome for a moment, and I want you to take a look at the difference in here. So Craigslist and Pinterest both have non-rectangular square file backgrounds, right? So in here you can see that these were both done with circles as the defining shape in here, where the Facebook is a square and Amazon has slightly more rounded corners on its square graphic. So what I'm going to be doing with this one right now is I'm going to be working with a transparent background. So in order for me to be able to do that, and I'm going to go ahead and swap back into Photoshop right now, what I want to do in here with the background is I need to both unlock it and then I need to also turn it off. So I'm going to double click on the layer to get to the OK button, which I can then turn that background off with the eyeball. What I see now is that my canvas is transparent, and we can identify transparency in a graphic file based on the transparency grid that we're seeing here. So I don't currently have any graphics inside of this file. I don't have any layers that are visible inside of this file. Okay, so I don't have any layers that have any visible content on them inside of my layers panel right now. So I'm going to go ahead and get started by adding new content over the top of my background, which is currently transparent. And I'm going to go ahead and do that using the type tool. So when I come over here to the left-hand side into my tools panel, I can see that I have the type tool available. I'm going to go ahead and click on that one time. And then I am going to be coming over into the canvas or the document bounds, and I'm going to click one time in here. Now when I click, what you should be able to see right now is that there is a flashing cursor in here that's going to tell me a little bit about the scale of my text element. Now I'm certain that you can see this, but it's going all the way off the top ruler up here. So it's very, very, very large text, and that's just going to be too large for my Favicon graphic. So I'm going to come up to the top into what we call the options bar. This options bar up here is going to change based on whichever tool I am selected on in the left-hand toolbar. I'm going to take the font size that we have right now, and I'm just going to scale that down right now. I'm going to start it at 50 points so I can see better what scale the type is now. So it's a little bit big and actually didn't go, so I need to do that again. So I'm going to go ahead and just put an N in here, which is the first letter of my first name, and then I'm going to actually select over the top of that. So I'm just kind of moving my cursor back in, I'm putting it over the canvas in here, and I'm just going to click and drag to the left as though I'm trying to highlight that letter. Now that I have the letter highlighted, I'm going to be able to come up to the top, and I'm actually going to hover over this little t, big T, which is the font size indicator, and then I'm going to click and drag to the left-hand side until my letter form gets to be large enough that it will be able to sit on my screen, or at least sit better on my screen. Now I'm going to move over the over my selection, and as I move kind of off to the side, you can see that my cursor changes from being a text cursor into being a move cursor. So once I have this arrow and the 4 directional arrows connected to it, I can move this around, and I can take this and actually put it here into my canvas, so it's going to scale a little bit better. Now looking at this right now, I can tell that this typeface, which is called Impact, and we can see that up here, is a very condensed typeface. So it's narrow, but it's vertically pretty tall, comparatively speaking. So it's probably not going to fit and fill inside of my canvas equally, right? It's going to get taller and move beyond the vertical height of that box before it meets the width. So that's fine with me, but I do want to scale it up as large as I can so that it will fit properly. Just a little note on this: before you spend too much time working with size and working with position on the canvas, you're likely going to want to come over here and choose your typeface first. So let's say that I came in and I chose phosphate. And phosphate has different geometry, and it's actually going to fit maybe a little bit better inside of my canvas. So I want to make sure I have the typeface I plan on using first before I spend a lot of time dealing with the scaling and the positioning, since all of the type options are going to have different width versus height ratios. So as I scale this one up, you can see I'm getting much closer to the overall height of my canvas, and then I can come in and reposition this. This is going to look a lot nicer for me. Yes, I have a little bit of space left on the top and the bottom. If I wanted to be really particular about this, I could actually scale all the way up to almost the very, very, very edges of my canvas so that I am occupying my space most effectively. When I click out of it, I'm now going to see my letter form. And one of the nice things that I like about using the phosphate typeface is that it actually has a knockout in here where we have transparency in the middle of the letter form. So that's just going to add a little bit of extra interest. To change the color of my type, I'm going to go ahead and select it one more time. Again, with my text cursor, I just hover really close, click and drag. And then up here inside of my options bar, I have a very subtle color palette or color picker. I'm going to click on that right now, and then I can use my color wheel to pick a color that might come from my brand identity. So I'm going to come down in here into something that's more kind of a desaturated, deep blue, and I will say, okay, we're going to assume that that comes from my brand. Alright, so I've got my N in here. I am ready to take this out and save it for the web. So I'm going to come up through my file menu, and I want to go through the Save for Web dialog box, but before I do that, I actually want to save this out into my Assets folder on my Source folder in my Master folder. So this document, the way that it is right now, is not actually prepared to go into my root folder, so I need to save this out into my Source folder. I'm going to go ahead and do a File Save As in here. I'm going to keep the name as Favicon. I'm going to go ahead and put this out into my folder structure. Though for this particular website, I don't actually have a folder set up for my website that's going to go online. So instead, what I'm going to need to do with this right now is put it into my testing folder. Now that I have my file saved out as a PSD, I am able to generate the version of this file that is going to be saved for my Favicon in my website. So I'm going back up to the File menu. I'm going to go down to the Export and then over to Save for Web Legacy. The truth is that we can actually save this out as many different file types, but because I want to have the transparency in mind, I'm going to be saving this out as a PNG 24. And you can see that once I convert that into a PNG 24, I get my transparency back in here. My size is still set to 260 by 260 pixels. But right now I'm going to go ahead and scale this down to its final output dimension, which is going to be 16 pixels by 16 pixels. And when I click in my document window here, you're going to see that it scales down really, really, really small. This is actually more of the equivalent of 8 pixels by 8 pixels in here, so I'm going to take this and bump it up to 200%, and then you can get an idea about how my graphic might actually look as a favicon. So it's still really small, and it's hard to read because that transparency grid is still visible in the background, but I'm just going to trust the process, and I'm going to move through this and get the PNG version of this file out. I'm going to go ahead and save this, and I'm going to leave the name as Favicon Ping. The only issue that I see with this right now for my particular website process is that I already have a file called Favicon Ping in here, which is my testing favicon. So I'm going to be replacing that with this particular favicon that I'm working with. Yes, I do need to replace this. You won't be encountering this problem on your own website. And then when I'm done, I pop back out here into Photoshop. And at this point, I don't need to do anything with Photoshop, but if after loading my favicon graphic into my website, I realize that I have issues with readability, or the color isn't right, or I need to change the scale or the font, I would like to have this open still so I can quickly come back in, make changes, and export out a new Save for Web version of this file. So for right now, what I'm going to do is hop back over into my testing website, and I'm going to load this favicon into one of my documents. So for the final steps in this process of loading a favicon, I have moved back into my HTML document inside of Dreamweaver. In this case, I'm still working with my testing files from the background images and graphics portion of our final website, but you would be doing this on index.html for your final website. In this particular website project, you are only required to have a single page website, but on any other websites where you had multiple pages, such as your Site 1 project, you would need to load this same code snippet that I'm going to be putting in here in the head of this document into each one of your HTML files. Otherwise, only the pages that have the code will actually load the favicon, and the other pages, when they load up into your browser, will not come with the favicon. So here I am, and I have my title element here within the head of the document. Remember that the head is the communicator, and it has conversations with the browser about how the website should be rendered and understood. So employing and implementing a favicon or favicon is a part of that same communication process. I'm going to go ahead and move my cursor to the end of the closing title element. In an actual website, I would not have the internal CSS that is in here right now. So that's a little bit different from what your website should look like at this point also. But I'm going to come back in here again to the end of the closing of the title element, and I'm going to add in the content that will load my favicon. So what I'm going to be putting in here is a link, and the link is going to be set to icon, and then we are going to have the type is going to be set to image/X icon, and the very last attribute of this is going to be the href, which is where is the favicon that's going to be loaded. So as soon as I type in the href in here and I put my equal sign and my quotations, a list of assets that I have inside of my folder over here in the files panel is going to show up. So I'm going to be working with favicon.png for this. And the favicon.png that I'm working with, when I hover over it, I can get a very low fidelity preview of what it is, but that helps me just double check to make sure that I'm working with the file that I expect to be working with. Now at the end of that, I'm going to do a slash and then a bracket. In my code sample, there is no slash forward. In HTML5, it's appropriate to not have the slash forward when you are closing a self-closing tag. In earlier versions of HTML and also for Dreamweaver, Dreamweaver really likes it when we have the slash here at the end. When I say a self-closing tag, what I mean is that there is no opening link and then closing link. This is the opening portion of this code snippet, and this says we have ended that code snippet. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and do a file save all on this, and I want to give you a heads up because most of you will think that this process is not working properly at this point, because you're going to want to go and try it by loading the preview from within Dreamweaver. And unfortunately, the favicon graphic will not show up here inside of the tab when we load it through Dreamweaver. So instead of doing it that way, we're actually going to have to go through your file navigator, and that might be My Computer or Finder if you're on a Mac, and you're going to have to open up your HTML file into the browser from your file navigator. So I'm going to do that here on a Mac by going out to the Finder. From the Finder, I'm going to go and navigate to my website folder. Then when I get into my website folder, what I need to do is find my file that I'm working with, which is called the repeat background. I'm going to right click on that and I'm going to open this with Chrome. When I open up my file through Chrome, you can see that my favicon does in fact load. But when I opened the exact same document through Dreamweaver, my graphic did not load, right? So this is something that I want you to double check before you submit this or before you panic and think that your favicon graphic is not actually loaded. So now that I have my favicon in here, I have completed this process and I am one step closer to turning in my final site.